Good afternoon, President Robert Atkinson, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure to co-host today's conference with Information Technology Innovation Foundation, or ITIF, on National Innovation System. Today's conference is the public rollout of the project that the Che Institute and ITIF have been working together over the past years. As you may be well aware, one of the key missions of the Che Institute is to investigate the impact of scientific and technological innovation on geopolitical and geoeconomic dynamics in Northeast Asia and beyond. While innovations are nothing new in human history, the speed and scope of their impact on today's world is truly unprecedented. When President Atkinson first proposed to me the idea of understanding and comparing the innovation systems of United States, Korea, and China a couple years ago, I thought the idea was very timely and relevant. Moreover, I counter-proposed to add Japan and Taiwan to the three countries because it could provide an even more holistic and vivid picture of the dynamic nature of innovations in the broader Northeast Asian region and in the Pacific. As a result, President Atkinson and I agreed to analyze and compare the national innovation systems of 5 global leaders in technology and innovations. Over the past years, ITIF and Che Institute have had a number of meetings to coordinate what we are going to highlight, how we are going to analyze, and ultimately what message we are trying to convey as we compare the innovation system of the 5 nations. The last month, our efforts culminated in a full 2 days offline workshop in Washington, D.C., where we shared and discussed our findings with all the key participants. Today, I'm proud to say that we are gathered here to share more refined outcomes of our project. Against this backdrop, I'd like to draw your special attention to the 3 points. First, this project mainly examined 5 innovation systems of US, China, Korea, Japan, and Taiwan that have served as driving forces behind each country's signature innovations. Second, we take a look back at each country's innovation history and try to get invaluable lessons contributing to the creation of each country's unique system, respectively. Finally, despite the challenge posed by the unique cultural, economic, social characteristics, and various endowment of natural resources of each country, the project aims to draw common denominators and come up with guidelines for the success of the 5-nation innovation system. I hope today's conference will provide a great momentum to usher in a new era of durable peace and co-prosperity in Northeast Asia and in the Pacific. I thank you.
Always enjoy coming to Korea. It's such a wonderful place to be, and this trip is no exception. So why are we doing this project? I think that's a really important question to start with. And I think there's several reasons why. If you follow the literature, the scholarly literature on national innovation systems, it really goes back to the late 70s and early 80s, particularly coming out of the UK. University of Sussex in particular, a whole team there, Chris Freeman and others. And they came up with this idea of national innovation systems. And why that was so important is because in conventional economics, there's no such thing as a system. There's only a market, and all markets are the same. They're just basically price and quantity. My daughter is about to graduate high school in the U.S., and so there's a thing called the AP test, Advanced Placement Test, and she's going to take macroeconomics. And so we go on long walks, and I have a little macroeconomics app on my phone, and I read her all this stuff, and it's basically, if supply goes up and demand stays the same, what happens to price? I think it goes up. I'm being a little facetious, but that's kind of how economics thinks about these questions. And in reality, when you're trying to understand innovation in an economy and the ability of an economy to produce innovation, you really have to approach it from a systems perspective. And that's why I think what President Park of the Che Institute understood when he proposed that we do this project together. So I think that's a big reason why these are important. It's not a question of just simply we all have economies. It's not even a question of all 5 countries we're looking at do R&D and have universities, and they have entrepreneurs and they have big technology companies. It's not really those questions. It's sort of the underlying questions of how these systems are different and where each system has strengths and weaknesses, because I think that's another key factor here. My colleague Stephen Ezell and I at ITIF, for a number of years, we've done different reports of comparing different countries on different measures around innovation. And we keep looking for the perfect country. And it's a little bit like finding a pink unicorn. I don't think the perfect country exists. I can tell you what I think a perfect country would look like when it comes to innovation, but I've yet to find it. And the reason is each country has its own unique strengths and weaknesses, and nobody's perfect on everything. And I think that's one of the questions that we want to look at here. Okay. So this is ITIF. We're a think tank based in Washington, D.C. We've been in existence since 2006. And we focus on a wide array of technology policy issues, not just in the United States, but really all around the world. What's a national innovation system? It's 3 things. It's national. So one of the questions we got, or at least I got early on doing this project, is, well, why are you studying national innovation systems? Innovation now is global. Of course innovation is global. The economy, world economy is global, but to say that there's one global innovation system is vastly oversimplistic. There are different innovation systems within that each country has. And even within a country, there are different innovation systems. So the innovation system in Silicon Valley is actually very different than the innovation system in Boston, which is another high-tech hub in the U.S. So national innovation, the nexus is about the nation, in part because nations themselves have an array of policies they put in place. It's obviously about innovation. What do we mean by that? We mean the ability of a country to produce new things, whether it's new products or new business models or new services, and to also produce in new ways. So innovation is not just about a product, but it's about process. And I think we'll see in here a little later, when you think about producing in new ways, Korea leads the world in robots per manufacturing worker, and not only by a little bit, but by a lot, which is something that you should be very proud of. Making the robot is a product innovation. Using robots to produce things is a process innovation. And finally, it's a system. And what do I mean by that? Again, I mean by that is economists think of economies as price-mediated markets. They think of economies as basically the little public square you would go to on Saturday morning, and I want to sell you some cloth, and you want to sell me some carrots, and then we somehow have this little thing of exchange, and we exchange, and we're all better off. Well, the question is, where did the cloth come from? And why are my carrots better this year than they were last year? Those questions don't get asked very much in economics. In other words, the question of how does change happen in an economy? And that's really the most important thing. A few years ago when I was visiting Korea, and I apologize, I have no idea where I was, but it was someplace near some small canal or something, and it was a historical thing, and it had a bunch of pictures of what Korea was like in 1955, which was not a very prosperous place, as you all know. So Korea has changed in that period of time, and it changed and developed because of innovation. So what we want to do today and in this project, we want to talk about, as I said, 4 nations, economies, if you will. 4 of them obviously have one thing in common, that they're Asian, and then the U.S. is not. But also all 5 have in common that each is working towards becoming innovation leaders and has success. Okay, so one of the things that we did in this is we talked, at the beginning of this project, of this report, I should say, we have some common metrics that we talk about in terms of how countries are different. And one sort of starting from the very beginning of the innovation system, which is, are you producing scientific knowledge or engineering knowledge? And this indicator is basically the citations per paper. So anybody can write a paper, not that hard to get published paper. The question is, did anybody ever read it? Anybody ever cite it? So I've written scholarly papers, and I think my best friends have cited it. The question is, does it get a lot of citations? So those are, if you will, the most important. I think what that is the blue is about 10 years ago, and the orange is the most recent. So you can see, interesting, the U.S. leads, as you would perhaps not be surprised about, partly because of the long, outstanding history of U.S. research universities. You can see China has made significant progress, as has Korea. Taiwan and Japan both slightly lower. But the other thing you'll see is the 4 Asian countries have had greater rate of progress over the last decade than has the United States. So that's kind of at the very beginning of an innovation system, if you will, just how much important science is being produced. The second would be, what is the quality of and number of research universities? So what we're really doing here is we're looking at the top 2,000 research universities ranked by all these various measures, mostly of academic quality and publications, and then looking at the number of them divided by the population, because it's unfair to say that Taiwan has only 7 research universities that are top ranked and the U.S. has 200, obviously unfair. So again, what you see there is the United States is number 1, but surprisingly, at least to me, I didn't expect this, Taiwan is number 2, partly because they're smaller, but they have some very, very strong universities. And then Korea is number 3. Japan, though, given the fact that you know, a couple of really major universities we think about in Japan, like Tokyo University, does not rank very well here, and China ranks much, much worse. Now again, the issue with China is everybody thinks China is doing great, but that's because they have 1.3 billion people. You're going to produce something with 1.3 billion people, but when you look at it on a per capita or per GDP basis, you see that China still ranks quite far behind, which is one of the reasons why they send over so many of their students to the US or to other countries. When I got my PhD, there were a lot of Korean students in my program, and there were Taiwanese students at my university. That's less so now because the university has gotten so much better here. China's still in that phase of sending a lot of their students overseas. Okay, now the next one would be, how many graduates do you have that are, as a share of total graduates, how many of them are science, technology, engineering, or math? And what you can see there is China does lead. An enormous number of students in China get degrees in science and engineering, partly because they believe it's the best way to get a job. You know, a significant share of students now who want to study French literature or feminist political theory. My sister-in-law, my daughter-in-law is getting her PhD in. I hope she can get a job. My son's getting a PhD in AI. I think he can get a job, but it is an issue in the US, just a significantly fewer number of people going into STEM. And then I'm trying to kind of move up, if you will, in this hierarchy of slides and data to now kind of researchers who are actually in the workforce. What percent of workers of total employment are in the workforce 2010 to 2020? And you can see Korea is number 1. has the highest share of its workforce are technology researchers. Taiwan is number 2, Japan, United States, and China. Again, China, we think it's so good because it's so big, but again, there's a lot more people in China who are working on farms than there are who are researchers right now. The next one, again, kind of keep going up, if you will, which is the amount of R&D that businesses perform. This is a critical factor. Government R&D is important, but at the end of the day, business R&D is what is behind product development and competitiveness. Again, Korea, number 1. This is, as a share of GDP, almost 4%. Taiwan, number 3. And again, in both Taiwan and Korean cases, driven significantly by large R&D intensive companies. United States is number 3, Japan, and then China. But again, as you can see, significant growth in Korea, China, Taiwan. Okay, then as you keep going sort of down the path towards newness, if you will, you get venture capital. Now, this should come as no surprise. There are no data available for, at least comparable data available for Taiwan, which is why it's obviously not here. But if you look at venture capital as a share of deals, as a share of GDP, you can see the U.S. leads significantly. And Japan, surprisingly, by the way, these numbers, the way they're reported, they're not exactly 0.2 and 0.1. They're reported that way in part, I think, for confidentiality reasons, but you'll see the general trend there. China and Korea lagging on the amount of venture capital. Japan surprised me, though. Japan is sort of, as Stephen will talk about, a country where you don't really think of the venture system as all that well, but it's certainly it looks above Korea. Software spending. I put this in here because one of the keys I mentioned to a successful innovation economy is the ability of companies to innovate in terms of how they produce. And software is a key component of that. It has been, as Mark Andreessen once said, software is eating the world. And AI is obviously part of software. Cloud computing systems are part of software, et cetera, et cetera. The U.S. is simply better at that in terms of our enterprises adopt and use a lot more IT. China is surprisingly number 2. But if you see Korea, it's a country that appears to have actually gone down, at least according to the OECD data, or the data we had there. You know, I was struck, I flew out on Air Canada for a number of reasons to Tokyo, and when I fly on American United Airlines in the United States, I can get my boarding pass and I just click a little button and it's, do you want to put it into your Apple Wallet? Which is very nice. I put it in my Apple Wallet, I have it right there. But Air Canada didn't have that. And if you look at software per GDP in Canada, it's a lot lower than the U.S. So I think that's an important indicator, and it's an area, frankly, where the U.S. does significantly better than almost any other country. I think only Sweden is better on that than we are. Another measure of of innovation is how the ability to create firms that get to $1 billion a year in sales quite quickly. United States is the best on that. This is, again, as a share of GDP, so we're controlling for size. Japan, pretty much nothing, and Taiwan, very low, and Korea somewhere in the middle there. Okay, I mentioned before about how important adopting innovation is. It's one thing if you, let me actually frame it this way. There's really 3 things that I think are important about innovation. One is, can you produce new entrants, companies that are coming into the marketplace with new ideas and disruptive? As a general rule, the U.S. does pretty well at that. The second is, do you have enterprises that are able to make advanced products, advanced technology products at scale for global market success? There, I think Korea and Japan and Taiwan do very, very well, and China is working on that. And then the third is about, Are you adopting technologies that are innovative, whether that's AI in the production process? That's a question I think everybody now is looking at. How well are our enterprises adopting AI? But one is robot adoption. And this is a study that we did at ITIF looking at how many robots do you have in manufacturing as a share of your workers, but controlling for wage levels. So if you're in China, it makes less economic sense to buy a $300,000 robot than it does in Korea, because you can pay your workers 30% of what you're paying in Korea. So the robot takes a long time to pay off. Even with that, what you see are that the two leading countries here by far are China and Korea in terms of robot adoption, and then Taiwan. And one of the reasons for China is just massive, massive, massive subsidies for robot adoption. They are just paying their companies to put robots in. All right, and the last set of metrics to compare countries or economies to is just this question of how much do you have of advanced industries? And the common measure there is what's called value added. So it's how much do your companies add value to advanced products. So you don't count the sand that Intel or Samsung buy to make semiconductors. You count the value of the chip itself minus the inputs, to use that as an example. And what this study shows is it's looking at 10 advanced industries, semiconductors and computers, aerospace, biotechnology, electrical equipment, et cetera. And it says, how big are these industries in each of these economies? So it's kind of an indicator of how specialized each country or economy is in advanced industries. And what you find are that Taiwan is the most specialized, largely because of semiconductors. TSMC and a few other companies there that are making massive amounts of semiconductors. They're just so big that they bump Taiwan up to more than double the global average. Korea has gone down a bit in the last decade, but still is about 75% more specialized in these advanced industries than the rest of the world. China next, Japan, and then the US lagging at the end. Okay, so let me, with that, segue into understanding the US National Innovation System. And the US National Innovation System is, I think, quite unique in a lot of ways. It, for many, many years, was clearly the most successful innovation system in the world. And I think, as I'll talk about in a moment, it's an innovation system now that, for a number of different reasons, is struggling. I won't go into a long detail of the U.S. innovation system, but nonetheless, we have had an innovation system since the founding of the Republic. The innovation system from 1776 to 1861 was based upon one single thing. We need to not be dependent on Great Britain. We cannot be dependent upon them because they might go to war with us. There's a great line by Thomas Jefferson, who before the War of 1812 was saying, we don't need to have industry in the U.S. We can rely on Great Britain for that. We will just make lumber and agricultural products and tobacco and send it off to Britain, and they'll give us what we need. And Jefferson, to his credit, in 1816 said, I was wrong. I assumed Britain was going to be our ally. They're not. So we have to have our own industrial system. And that was done through many, many areas, the most important one being the U.S. armory system. The United States was able to achieve mass production interchangeable parts 50 years before Great Britain. So Great Britain in the early 1800s was the industrial leader. After we were able to do what we did in the U.S., we had interchangeable parts 50 years before the Brits, and it was because of these efforts. And that was why we had the sewing machine, the auto industry, the clock industry, et cetera, et cetera. We were able to use interchangeable parts. The Brits were still hand filing parts to get them to their correct level of precision. 1861 to World War II was really a period where the United States said, you know what, we think we can be the greatest country in the world. We look over here at Britain, we look over here at Germany, and we think we can be the greatest country in the world. Interestingly enough, during the Civil War, you had the most energetic period of American industrial policy in our history. We did more in those 5 years for American industrial development than any 5-year period. We created the intercontinental railroad system. We created what this whole series or system of land-grant universities, and a whole number of other things. We supported the telegraph development. And the reason we did that is because we didn't have the South in the Congress. And the South historically in the U.S. was an agricultural, they wanted low tariffs and didn't really want development. When they were out of the Congress, the North basically put in place all of these programs. World War II to 1779, that was basically a period of one thing. So the first thing was don't be dependent on Britain. The second period was become the global leader. And the third period was we have to beat the Soviets. And everything in the U.S., everything was organized around winning against the Soviet challenge, which was epitomized by Sputnik. So in 1962, the United States government invested more in R&D, spent more on R&D than every other country in the world combined. All the businesses outside the U.S., all the governments outside the U.S. The U.S. government spent more on R&D. So you want to know why the U.S. had such an enormous lead? It was because of that early investment in 45 to 70, let's say, that really gave us this lead. By the early 1980s, the challenge had again shifted away from the Soviet Union, which we saw, rightly so, as an economic basket case, kind of a militarized third world country, to the Japan challenge. And the Japan challenge was quite serious. People forget how serious it was. Japan at one point produced more advanced value-added technology production than the U.S. did, more. And they were they were 60% of our size. So we put in place a whole array of programs and policies in the 1980s and 90s that people forget about. Semitech for our semiconductor industry, the Small Business Innovation Research Program, the refashioning of the National Bureau of Standards into the National Institute of Standards and Technology. We changed our laws to allow pension funds to invest in venture capital. We created the R&D tax credit. We created a law called the Stevenson-Weidler Act to allow federal labs to commercialize technology more easily. And it was an amazing flourishing of legislative and administrative activity that really did make a difference. And then we developed what was called Wintelism, Windows and Intel, and we were leading the world. We had Windows, we had Intel, and we didn't need to worry anymore. Japan had its bubble collapse, and we were riding high. We were number one, and on top of that, free market economists took over and said, don't worry about anything. And so we went to sleep. And we were asleep really until, you could argue, 2018. In other words, we didn't think we needed an innovation policy. We were number one. We were the best. And it was really only until the middle of the Trump administration that there was an awakening in the U.S. that we needed to have a more active and robust national innovation policy. Okay, so what does that system look like? Well, first of all, it really is not a policy. If you go and you look and try to go through the history of the U.S. in the last 30 years and look at all the White House documents and you try to identify the innovation policy for the United States, you cannot find one because one has never been written. The Obama administration had a thing they called the innovation policy, and they actually released it at an event that we hosted. It wasn't really an innovation policy. It was a list of things they were doing, and they called it an innovation policy. And I don't mean to criticize any particular party or administration, but there's no strategy. There's no, what the Germans have done, for example, a SWOT analysis. What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? What are our opportunities? What are our threats? That doesn't exist in the U.S. because we don't believe in it. We're getting closer to that, but we haven't done it yet. There's also a belief that the most important thing is just let the market make these decisions. Now, to be sure, you don't want to do dumb things. I was talking once with a high-level Chinese official at a major ministry, and I was talking to him about what they were doing on technology, and he explained to me, he said, Rob, we have a history of tragedies in China. And I thought, I wonder, what do you mean, earthquakes? Or there's been an earthquake recently? And I said, He goes, no, no, no. Right before the introduction of the Blu-ray player, we decided we were going to lead in the VCR industry. So we spent billions on building VCR factories. And then the DVD came along and it just went up in smoke, and he called that a tragedy. Well, yeah, that's kind of dumb, you know, pretty clear Blu-ray was going to come along. What were you thinking? That was a mistake. And to his credit, he said, well, we're trying to learn. We're trying to not do things like that anymore. So clearly you don't want government to make these kind of heavy-handed, overriding market signals kind of things. But in the U.S., we don't do the opposite, we don't do the other thing, which would be to say, wait a minute, there are key technologies that are important, and we have to support them. On the other hand, it's not as if the government hasn't played a role. And the major role for innovation in the U.S., as most of you know, has been national missions, particularly defense. Defense has driven much of the U.S. innovation system, particularly DARPA, but not just DARPA, but weapons systems developments. If you go back and you look at most of the major IT innovations that the U.S. pioneered in the world, most of them were coming out of defense applications. Okay, so again, overarching features is a focus on markets, not explicit industrial policy. Tech policy is mission-oriented. Competitiveness is not a mission. Just make that quite clear. People now are saying, well, the U.S. has changed. Industrial policy and competitiveness is a mission, and now we're finally doing that. That actually is not true, I would argue. If you look in the last 3 years of what happened, this was driven by Congress, driven by the U.S. Senate. My colleague Stephen Ezell and I helped play some role in that, working with Senator Schumer and Senator Young on crafting that legislation. There were 3 big components: the CHIPS Act, or the Chips and Science Act, but the CHIPS component about semiconductors, that was a defense bill. That was only passed because we worried that Taiwan would be taken over by the People's Republic of China, and we would be out and dependent upon chips, so we passed that because of defense. The science component of the CHIPS and Science Act is a science bill. It just gives money to the National Science Foundation to fund more science, simplifying slightly. And the IRA, which is an important act, obviously, for many Korean companies because it gives very large tax credits to build certain types of facilities in the U.S., was an energy bill, a clean energy bill. It wasn't an industrial policy. That was a secondary component of it. Was we're going to revitalize the energy system by funding batteries, solar, et cetera, EVs. That was an energy policy. It wasn't an industrial policy. Another part of that, as I mentioned before, sorry I spelled complacency wrong, complacency of the leader. We still have that. I think one of the problems of being a leader is you get lazy. We see that with companies. Many companies that get to the top get lazy, and that's why there's so many CEOs now that that's their core mission, is to not get lazy. To not, as Andy Grove of Intel said, only the paranoid survive. It's easy to not be paranoid when you're number one. We're ranked number 1 think tank in the world on science and technology by University of Penn, but I keep trying to tell myself that I need to keep being paranoid. In other words, once you give that up, you lose. And it's true as a country. If a country doesn't have that level of sort of fear or edge, it's easy to lose. A colleague of mine at Georgia Tech wrote a great book called The Politics of Technology. I can't remember his name. Political Economy of Innovation. I'll get it later, sorry. It's a wonderful book. But he tries to go around and go, why are some countries good at innovation and some countries aren't? And he looks at everything, and he does all the variables, this and that, and he comes down to one conclusion. Do you think that your country is at existential risk? And if you do, then you're going to be a lot more focused on innovation. So who's at existential risk? Korea. You got this guy 100 miles north here, or who knows how many miles. Existential risk. So Korea has to focus on innovation. Taiwan, existential risk. Who are the other leaders he talks about? Singapore, city-state, has to have something. Israel, why is Israel such a leader? And he talks about the U.S. Well, what was the existential risk for the U.S.? Was the Soviet Union. Once that went away, that took away our existential risk, and we've become lazy. If you look at, for example, Canada, a country whose innovation performance has frankly been very, very poor over the last 30 years, Canada has no existential risk because they can depend upon us. We will protect Canada. We're not going to invade them, even though there was a movie about that recently, it's a comedy movie where we invade them. We're not, and they know that. And so there's no existential risk. So part of success, I think, in innovation is you have to want it. And the reason you have to want it is because, as Joseph Schumpeter said about innovation, it's about creative destruction. It's not about an easy path. It's not, oh, it's going to be nice. It's about companies winning and losing. It's about certain occupations winning and losing. It's about certain regions winning and losing. And if you're not a country that's willing to tolerate some of that pain because you know you have to keep going further, you're not going to be good at innovation. Weak on production. I think if you look at the U.S. innovation system, which is why it's such a model for people, what we're really good at is we're really good at kind of two components: science-based innovation, so biotech, semiconductors, and we're really good at creating new companies. We're not as good at scaling new companies. So we have a new report coming out next month looking at the Chinese robotic innovation compared to the U.S. There's a global competition, the most innovative robotic products of the last year. And of the 50 products, 33 were American. Name me one American robotic company. Nobody can do it because they're all little. The big robotic companies are in Japan, in Germany, and some other places. So again, U.S. is really good at creating new companies. The question is, can we scale those and get them to production domestically? And that, as I said before, strong on innovation and risk-taking. I was in Japan a few years ago, and a number of CEOs, I was relating some story about my son getting into computer science. He wanted to go work in the Valley. My son did get into computer science. He did go work in the Valley. He did get stock options. Hasn't been able to exercise them yet, but when he does, I'm looking forward to that day. And the Japanese, one of the Japanese officials said, "Aren't you worried that your son's startup that he works for could go out of business?" And I was like, no. I mean, I've kind of astounded at that question. Why would I worry about that? He would be in Silicon Valley. He would have learned incredible experience for a company that goes out of business. And then he would just take that and go to another company. And I asked my colleague there, how would you feel if your son did that? And he, no, that'd be terrible. My son would be off the track for life. And that is one of the really, I think, important parts about the U.S. innovation system is you can and are encouraged to take big risks. And I think that's really one of the reasons why Silicon Valley is so successful. This was a report by our friends in the Bay Area Economic Council, looked at the culture of innovation in Silicon Valley. And what you can see there is a whole set of factors that, where would you put that in an economic model? You know, you can't put that in an economic model because it's about culture, it's about institutions, it's about ideas. I was reading on the plane ride over the new biography of Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson. And, a lot of that's just Steve Jobs goes into a meeting with somebody to sell or buy something. I can't remember what it was. He puts his feet up on the guy's desk and he has no shoes on, and he has long hair. That's pretty weird, but it worked. So open to ideas, set crazy goals, experiment rapidly, fail fast, get to market first because scale matters, focus on unmet consumer needs. So there is a culture that is very attuned and aligned with the ability to create new market entrants, and that's obviously what Silicon Valley and parts of the U.S. has. So what are the strengths of our system? The U.S. system, I would argue, has highly innovative private sector. We've got the best and deepest venture capital system in the world. We still have world-leading universities, even though we're not funding them as well as we used to. We have ability to compete in pretty much every field. Most other countries, with the exception of China, are much more specialized. For example, when you look at the evidence of the data, Korea doesn't do very well in biotechnology, doesn't do well in aerospace, does really well in electronics, does really well in semiconductors. And lastly, software. As software becomes more integral to virtually everything, the U.S. is the world leader in software capabilities, and that has been a real strength. All right, what are the weaknesses? Really, there are many, many weaknesses in the U.S. innovation system. They've only gotten worse, not better. One is faltering government R&D investment. Government R&D as a share of GDP is less than it was before the launch of Sputnik. So think about that. You have to go back to 1955 to get the level of R&D the federal government is spending as a share of our economy. And we're not spending very much on it anymore because everybody wants free everything and nobody wants their taxes to go up. We're weak at scaling innovations, as I talked about. Andy Grove, former Intel CEO, had a very famous article in Businessweek where he talks about the need for scaling, and he argued the U.S. needs a scaling bank. In other words, it's one thing to produce a new startup, it's another thing to scale it, and to scale it here. This is a good example of areas where we have been the developer, but not the ones that have have scaled it here. So IC packaging, batteries, LCDs, all areas, by the way, that you have done very well at scaling, complex fluorescent lighting, et cetera. A third area is corporate short-termism, and this is a problem mostly in the Anglo-American countries. The Brits have this problem. We have this problem. The Business Roundtable did a survey of 100 top CFOs and asked them, how many of you would be willing to cut your R&D to meet your quarterly earnings targets? 80% were willing to cut their R&D to meet their quarterly earnings targets. That's pretty damning when you think about that. Now, not to say every company's like that. I was on a panel number of years ago with Paul Jacobs, who at the time was the CEO of Qualcomm. His dad started it, and Jeff Bezos. They were, neither of those gentlemen were short-termists because it was their own company. And when it's your own company, you're thinking the long run. When you're a hired CEO, you're thinking oftentimes, how do I get my earnings up so that my market cap goes up? Domestic STEM pipeline, I talked about that earlier. I know this is a surprise to you. Inward-looking nationalism, you wouldn't have thought of that, would you, from the U.S.? The last administration and the current administration are much more inward-looking than prior administrations were. Ever since World War II, it's been the U.S. has had a mission of going out, helping the world organize, helping the world become a market-integrated world, helping the world become a safe world. And that has, I don't want to say come to an end, but it certainly hit a stumbling block in the U.S. where both parties now, and certainly this administration and the last administration, have become much more inward-looking. And the reason I put that on the innovation system part, it's very hard to, I think, ultimately be strong in innovation unless you're out in the world, working to get into other markets and being integrated with the rest of the world. Lastly, I can't give any speech without hawking my new book, which will be coming out next month, I believe. It's called Technology, Fears, and Scapegoats, 40 Myths about Policy, Privacy, Jobs, AI, and Today's Innovation Economy. This is a big problem in the U.S., and I don't know how much it is in Korea. It's not a problem in China. And the problem in the U.S. is an increasing amount of fear about technology. When the internet came out in the U.S., there was virtually no opposition. There were no articles that said, oh, this thing could do bad things. It was all upside. Wow, the internet, AI, 7 out of 10 articles are how bad this is going to be, how many harms this is going to cause. what we're seeing is a very kind of negative orientation to technology, a very negative orientation to companies that are bringing technologies to the market. And that's a very different norm than what the U.S. has had. The U.S. has always been, for as long as we can go back, the U.S. has been the place where we were pro-innovation. In the U.S., it was always, let's innovate, we'll worry about something afterwards. In Europe, it's been, we'll worry about it now and maybe not innovate. The U.S. is becoming more European in that regard, and I think that's a very dangerous component to have a successful national innovation system. Lastly, as I mentioned before, are we embracing a techno-economic policy? Not really. At the margin, various pieces we are here and there. There is much more of a wake-up in the United States that China is our new existential threat, our new competitor, not just militarily, not just for global influence, but also obviously for techno-economic advantage. And so that will motivate the U.S., but it's not going to, I would argue, we're still a long way from a very sophisticated policy. So I'll stop with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me here. It's a great honor in participating in this path-breaking project of comparing national innovation system of these 5 major countries. I'd like to start my talk with illustrating the Korea's economic transformation, because exploring those processes will reveal how those paths are related to innovations, and also in comparing these 5 countries, Korea would provide a unique insight in bridging the experience of perhaps like a Chinese experience and the US experience for now. This is a graph that shows how this real GDP per capita has been evolved since 1960s until 2019, and it increased the total GDP in real term like 54 times, sorry. And the real GDP per capita increased 26 times. So it's a real remarkable transformation. And I call it as a 6P60 growth experience because on average, 6% in terms of real GDP per capita has grown for 6 decades. I think the critical part is, well, 6% is rapid growth, but no country has maintained this rapid growth for 60 years. So we'll soon see that this maintenance of a 60-year growth is indeed related to innovation. So, but there are 2 critical transformation periods in Korean economic growth. First, in 1960s and 70s, for those 2 decades, its Korean growth path is really resemble typical emerging economies. Fast growth, but mostly the sources of growth is input expansion, basically mobilizing labor and also sending kids to schools, and also the continuous and rapid accumulation of physical capital, building infrastructure and ports, airports, roads. Those were the main sources of growth in 60s and 70s. And normally, many developing countries stop their growth there. And around that level of income is like a middle income group. That's why it's called the middle income trap. And the middle income trap is very hard to escape for the developing countries, but Korea stayed in that range only for less than 10 years. So I think that's very unique in the world growth history. For European countries, obviously it escaped from the middle income trap, but it takes like 200 years, 300 years. But it happened within such a short time was a key aspect. And behind that escape from the MIT, middle income trap, was because its transformation of economic growth mechanisms from the so-called perspiration, input-based, and the inspiration, productivity-based. That happened in 1990s. Interestingly, that was the critical period when the Korean national innovation system has changed. So there are some period marked by its period, like first transformation, second transformation, and within second transformation, it's marked by the TF growth driven, and also recently and unfortunately, the TF growth era is beginning to stagnate. So that's a second challenge for Korea. And it's a good time to think about how to rebuild the national innovation system of Korea. And this is the little empirical work of decomposing the income growth of Korea. And it shows that I'd like to tell you at the low part of the TFP growth, as you can see, in 60s, basically productivity growth was zero. In 70s, it was even slightly negative. That's when the so-called the Korean industrial structure switched from the light manufacturing into the heavy and chemical auto industry and so on. At that time, the main source was just the capital accumulation. There was no productivity growth. And then suddenly it switched from a slight negative into 2.8% productivity growth only. The total income growth was like ranged about 8 to 10%. So 2.8% was a really high productivity growth. And then it has been maintained about 30 years. And suddenly after 2010, to be specific, 2012, it slipped around like a 0.5%. So that's a landscape of how this Korea has been transformed. And then that way, Korean economists and also many policymakers in developing countries try to learn the lessons from Korea, but they pay attention to the first transformation, which is the takeoff period. However, I think the real critical transformation is the second transformation. And actually, I myself did a counterfactual analysis. What would be the Korean income without such productivity growth and no like a human capital growth? And by now, actually, it turned out the Korean income resembles Nigeria or Indian income. So maintaining 30 years of productivity growth was the key, and we all know from economic growth theories, the only source that can sustain economic growth is productivity, because capital is subject to the famous diminishing returns. And then that was visioned by Solow in 60s, but it was actually visioned by the famous economist called David Ricardo in 19th century. So escaping from that era to the innovation-driven economy is the key to make the so-called sustainable development. And let me go back. This is what happened in the second transformation. First, Korean society was democratized in two ways. One is political way, and then there was a big movement. We all know that. But not many people pay attention to the economic democratization. That period is when the most sector was liberalized, and also in terms of trade and investment, and also the so-called deregulation measures started to work. So resource mechanism, allocation mechanism, switched from the planning mechanism to the market mechanism. That was a critical period. And that happened in 80s and continued to 90s. And then the macroeconomic stability is another thing that happened during the second transformation. So before 80s, the Korean inflation rate really resembles like a developing countries, 20%, 30%, and it's widely fluctuate. And also the interest rate is like a 10 to 20%. And all of a sudden, when the Korean economy got stabilized in terms of macroeconomy, the price level like 2 to 3%, and the interest rate in terms of real term normalized by like a 5 to 3%. So along with that stabilized economy, innovation worked. And the third thing happened is its national innovation system has switched from the planned system to the like a private sector-led system. And that's before 1980s. Korean national innovation system was mainly to back up the famous 5-year economic development plan. So government set up the development plan and then identify the technologies to back up those 5-year development plan, and then they put money into there. And that was the main governance system. But since 1980s and 1990s, they started to give up that kind of like mechanisms of innovation. And then they tried to shift the resources and the discretion to the private companies. And that's exactly when the R&D investment started to take off. So, and that has been maintained since then. I think it's an important message for other developing countries if they really want to maintain and continue their growth. We all know that after 2000, that the engine of growth has shifted from the advanced economies to the emerging economies. But unless this kind of transformation happens, those emerging countries may stop there very soon. So, and another thing that I want to emphasize is before this kind of growth mechanism and innovation governance changed, there was a prior investment, which is like a physical and also human capital investment for 2 decades was the real ground for those innovation system change. So without those accumulation of capital, I don't think simply changing governance or just bring up good ideas will not actually be realized. So that was also an important background of this transformation. And then I want to point one more thing about what happened during this second transformation, which is this is exactly when the Korea took the big risk, as already Dr. Atkinson suggested. There was a Japan kind of crisis in US, and that was basically 80s, interestingly. And then at the time, Korea, to be specific, Samsung tries to really expand its semiconductor industry, and almost all people told those Samsung executives that's a crazy idea, really. And but Samsung took such a big risk and actually aggressively expanded more and more. And then the Samsung invented the famous 64K DRAM as a first in the world in 1983. And that was the really a big sign for the later global dominance of Samsung in semiconductor chip production. And well, this is the I think Dr. Atkinson already showed the histogram comparison, but about these R&D activities. Here, this is the time path, how fast those R&D investment in terms of money and in terms of people has expanded. And in particular for the, in terms of people, number of researchers per million, Korea is way up. And it's ranked as a number 1. And in terms of investment, it's next to Israel. And so this is but if you go back to the 1990s, it's not that high. So that transformation happened really fast. And in terms of output, measured by the number of patents granted, not applied, the granted patents, it is also growing very fast. But on the left graph, the number of patents per people, It's rising fast, but it's like a still lag behind the leaders. And if you measure the number of patents per researcher, that may tell you the productivity of researcher in producing granted patents. There is still a gap for Korea to catch up. And then the cross-country comparison was already nicely covered by Dr. Atkinson. So I want to pay attention to the Korean NIS system itself. And this is how the Korean STI policy orientation has evolved. And in 60s and 70s, as I already told you, and STI policy was really the top-down system and focusing on to implement the 5-year economic development plans. And in 1980s and 1990s, the R&D investment has been expanded. Here, the main focal point at the time was to secure the independent capacity for innovation. Rather than producing products, they didn't put money in producing new products, but they really tried to build the capacity to innovate. That what happened in 80s and 90s. And then product investment started to happen only after 2000. So, and after 2000, the focal point has changed. They tried to catch up the global frontier of STI. And that's still going on. And let me, because of the time limit, let me move on. And Korea, perhaps unlike US, it has its own innovation policy framework explicitly. And that has been from the beginning and it's until now. But its framework also has changed, but let me pay attention to the main policy framework for now, which was established in 2002. That's the Science and Technology Basic Plan. And it's still the 5-year term. I don't know why the 5 is a matching number, but it's always 5. It's the guideline for the ministries. And why ministries? Because in a way, Korean government took the importance of innovation perhaps too much. So there is no single innovation department or the ministry or agency. Every ministry, to be specific, 14 ministries has their own innovation plans. And they propose it to the presidential office and try to implement. And it's too many, so they need guidelines to coordinate. That coordination is done under this plan, this basic plan. This SNT basic plan is designed to be aligned with the presidential agendas. Each administration, when it begins, they set up like 100 presidential agendas and so on, and they try to fit those presidential agendas. So there's a good and bad about this system. Well, good thing perhaps is they try to think about innovations in the context of economic and social needs. That's a good part. However, bad part is when the administration changes, the priority issues change. Then the follow-up STI investment can change. So long-term investment is difficult under this. Coordination is a good one, but coordination for what? That's a missing part of the Korean NIS. And it's too much volatile. So, and indeed, there is a long-term plan, like a 10-year plan and so on, but it's most of those 10 long-term plans are, I would say, it's just word party, not substantial. So, and in terms of actors of Korean NIS, the government, I think I have explained this part before, but this is a little bit of detail. Before 2000 and after 2000, And then before 2000, it tries to provide the legal framework and also some coordination mechanism. And also another peculiar part of the Korean NIS is its role of the GRI, Government Research Institutes, or sometimes it's called the PRI, Public Research Institutes. They, rather than they directly set up one central agency for innovation, for example, like a DARPA, they really, there are so many PRIs that took these missions of the innovations. And that's why they emphasize the coordination, because it's fragmented. And after year 2000, they tried to make a governance reform. One of them was this basic plan. Let's make it formal rather than just informal dialogues. That's one. And then the other one is the Presidential Advisory Council. So there is a council of science and technology experts, and they advise the president. And there is I think I mentioned it in DC. The head of the council participates every single the meetings, presidential meetings. And another little confusing thing in the STI policy in Korea is they continuously repackaging ministries. When the knowledge economy is a key thing, they create the Ministry of Knowledge Economy. And then sometimes they merge between the science and technology with the Ministry of Education and then separate. Those things, that's the danger which were actually realized by those too much policy or politics-oriented STI governance. And the other actor is firms, not surprisingly, and firms is indeed the major actor in Korean NIS because 80% of the gross expenditure is covered by the private companies, and 72% of researchers are also hired by the companies, and 20% in universities, and then 7% in PRIs. And Korean R&D is really D-oriented, development-oriented R&D. So its share is about, development share is 70%. It's fairly robust. But there are two other categories, which is basic research and applied research. And the applied research covers, in 2020, 20%, and basic research only 10%. So that's, I think it's a critical weakness for the long-term plan. For short-term plan, it's a good thing. But for long-term plan, it may not be. And it relies mostly only on internal R&D. There is not much of the global partnership. So they don't invite, not just in terms of people, but also in terms of financing, invite the foreign resources in doing R&D. And also it's really manufacturing oriented, 85%. And then only 10% of R&D is invested in service, which includes software. So that is why it's no wonder why Korea is weak in software innovations. Simply, it's focusing on manufacturing. It tries to utilize its prior strength. And the third actor is university. And there are two tracks of governance in higher education in Korea. One is the regular or general universities governed under the Ministry of Education, but there is a second track, which is the so-called IST universities. And like KAIST, GIST, UNIST, and POSTECH, those IST is an institution for science and technology. That is under the governance of the Ministry of Science and Technology. So Ministry of Science and Technology has an independent group of universities. And there is about 150,000 STEM each year undergrad students. And there is another interesting incentive system in Korea. When you major in STEM major and you are committed to work on some destined PRIs or the government-oriented companies, your military services are exempt. So there is a big incentives to pursue STEM. In terms of number, it's a 2,400. It's a small portion, but it's a big incentives, and mostly the students from the elite schools utilize this system. So, and then the features of the university R&D is the main funding source is the government, not from the private company. That may be a key difference from US, perhaps. I'm not sure, but we can discuss about it. 82% of funding is coming from the government, only the 14% is coming from the private companies. But here the good thing and important thing is university pay attention to the basic research rather than the development. Unlike the average, like 38% is basic research and applied research, 31, and development only 32, while the national average 70% is the development. And that is why the university is an important player, because they create technology and pass on to the private companies. And PRI, as I told you, is also an important source of an actor of the Korean NIS. And there are two, again, groups of PRIs. One is 24 PRIs under the National Research Council for Economics, Humanities, and Social Science, like a KDI, where the Professor An is from, is one of them. And, but there is 21 independent PRIs about science and technology only. And their role is also very important because, in particular, those science and technology PRIs are the big sources of, again, creating technology. I took some examples here, like a LTE-based positioning system was invented by the KIST, and it was delivered to Kakao. And it's a very important technological innovation because you don't need to use GPS. You just need a phone to identify where you are and where are you going. So that's one example. And the other example is a CDMA system was actually invented by the Korean PRI called ETRI, Electronics and Telecommunication Research Institute. And that was passed again to the telecommunication industry. So that kind of thing, this kind of thing, and episodes are heard mostly, at least for me, is done in US by DARPA, but that role is covered by these PRIs in Korea. And linkages, well, those actors actually collaborate rather than work independently. From university, linkage is perhaps the most important one. There are 4 ways of doing it. One is they do just the collaborative R&D, and the second way is university retrain the research steps of the private companies. It's a big program. There are more than 200 programs and training, like more than 8,000 students. They are the researchers in Samsung and Hyundai and so on. In that way, this university R&D and the private sector R&D are tightly linked to each other because of this retraining program. And then technology transfer is a third one. And the first one is, well, university itself, like a Silicon Valley, which they spin off. The faculty spin off, but interesting thing is, incumbent student, they do create their own companies when they are, but they do graduate rather than quit universities. So, and the from PRI, not much, and the from government, Here, there is no direct collaboration, but government tries to provide just funding or the tax incentives. And the one peculiar part of this from government linkage is it's mostly focused on SMEs. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? My opinion, they could have been done better because in this linkage, they provide funding, not capacity building for SME. I think what SME actually needs in terms of innovation to promote the SME's innovations, they need the information and the capacity. They should provide those two pieces, critical pieces to SMEs, but they just deliver money. And then they don't know how to use that money because of lack of capacity and lack of information. So I think it's a misalignment. And three major ministries of supporting SME R&D is the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy, and 40%, and the Ministry of SMEs, and the Ministry of Science and Technology. It's interesting that the Ministry of Science and ICT covers only 8%. This is a little strange. The ministry which understands technology helps the SMEs only by 8%, but the general help is provided by the Ministry of Trade. And the government university is the main collaboration is the scholarship program, the so-called the Brain Korea, BK, and the research funding to HEIs. For this one, Korea is doing about the OECD average. And skip that. So I did evaluate overall performance by GI Global Innovation Index, but given that we discussed about it in DC, let me just quickly mention that it identified strength areas was human capital and research, and then creative outputs, and then business sophistication, and knowledge and technology outputs. And the weakness was the institutions. Mainly it is because of the heavy regulation. And the market sophistication, the market environment, and also the infrastructure was identified as weak areas. And then each area by area, there was an analysis identifying each indicator, which is the strength indicator and the weak indicator. But let me skip this part. Rather than doing that, I think contemplating the fundamentals of the weakness and the fundamentals of the strengths is more beneficial. So fundamentals of Korean NIS weakness is related those things, which is first, the underdeveloped legal and the financial institutions to promote risk-taking. I think for that part, perhaps US and China are way ahead. And this is where Korea really needs to compensate. And then one of the reasons is its legacy about relying on policy loans in doing innovation. Loans is just providing money. Again, in innovation, money should follow idea. So they should help promoting idea formation. But they just provide money. Why? Because it's easiest to implement. So that's why lack of venture capital activities in Korea is happening. And there is a little social protections for failing innovations. I think this is key. If you fail, one innovation and then you have to fail in your life, then nobody will innovate, right? So allowance of failure or protection of failure is key, but Korea doesn't have that kind of institutional arrangement of protecting failures. And that's why, as I told you, this explains why the lack of VC and also the external funding. The foreigners will not invest in innovation because it's not about product producing. It's about risk-taking, basically, innovation per se. Then the foreigners, well, if you are not protected from failures, again, they will not come into Korea to invest in innovation. And the second one is the labor market rigidity. And this is a fundamental problem of Korean society, which is the Korean government asks companies to protect workers. It's their job, actually. Government should protect workers and then let the companies to allow the flexible hiring and firing, but both hiring and firing and its protection are all companies' job. Then you cannot take a big risk. So that's the second fundamental of weakness. And the third one is, as I already told you, science and technology innovation governance is too complex. It should be really simplified. And then the inexperience of software innovation. That's perhaps, among all other things, maybe the most critical one. And inexperience of the product innovation, meaning creating new products. That's the weakness of Korea. Korea is very good at process innovation, or even for the product innovations, incremental innovation for the given products, Korea is very efficient, but not creating the new products. And heavy reliance on the external sector itself, because many parts of the major industrial sector relies on exports and external investment as well. And the final thing that this was interestingly already pointed by the Dr. Atkinson, short-sightedness. And then he called it short-termism, and that applies to Korean companies as well. But on top of that, the government seems to face the short-termism as well. Both public and private sector are suffering from this short-termism. But I'm not sure if this is really the Korea-specific or it's a global phenomena, because entire globe is facing the rising and then exacerbating uncertainty, which is different from the 20 years ago. So given such a rise in uncertainty, this short-termism or short-sightedness may be in some part inevitable. So that we should recognize that. And but given all this weakness, Korea has a big strength, which is the number one strength perhaps is Korea has a pool of high-quality labor, like college advancement rate is 70 to 80%, which is exceptionally high. The second highest is US, but US is 40%. So it's really high. So the pool of trained and high-quality labor is really abundant. And also, as I already told you, among them, many of them are doing research, so abundant researchers. And the second strength, I think, is its rapid and wide social connection. Why it's a good thing? Because Koreans are very good at sharing ideas and adopting new ideas. And I brought this graph here. Oops, yeah. This is the robot adoption rate per worker, actual adoption rate, so it's not normalized by the wages. And but here I want to emphasize, well, the level itself is far ahead than any other countries. But here I want to emphasize it's a changing amount for the same period. That's really big. So Korea's robot adoption rate in 90s and 2000 was very low actually, but it really fast increased. So so that gives us an idea the Koreans are kind of flexible in adopting new ideas and adaptation to changing environments. I think that's the fundamental strength, in particular given the era of the rising uncertainty. And the third one is they do recognize the importance of the STEM parents, and also the government. And they are, I already told you, they are very good at process innovations and the continuous incremental innovations. Actually, when I teach my course about smart city and science and technology innovation, I measured the counts in the entire human history, what was like a disruptive or revolutionary innovation versus gradual evolutionary innovations. The evolutionary innovation covers 90%. So that's quite important. And the tradition of the strong manufacturing, I think, is also a strength. And Koreans are very practical-minded. This pragmatism is, I think that's the common thing between Korea and US, and perhaps China as well. So, and Korea has a very strong resilience to big changes. Like its recovery from the Asian crisis took only a year, while the rest of the Asian economies took like 5 to 10 years. And the pandemic recovery was also quick. And the global financial crisis, it really muddled through, and it was flat rather than falling. So that kind of adaptation and the resilience is one of the key strengths. And this is the strategy to improve on Korean national innovation systems. Like we do need a targeted promotion of software innovations, and we have to simplify the STI policies. And first proposal, I think it's important. In forming the STI policies, current stakeholders are either government officials and science and technology experts, not the business people. But I do think they have to, because they do have a coordination system, they should invite the business enterprises, stakeholders to that meeting. And legal financial sector reform to embrace the risk-taking. And the other one is Korea do need to form a global and regional STI partnership. It is too much inwarded. They just do their research by their own without opening to others. In terms of product selling and investment, they are very open, but not much of sharing ideas or accepting new ideas from others. So that needs to be changed. And the last one is, well, as I told you, we do need to activate the long-term plan to avoid these short-sightedness. That's all about it, Korea. Thank you.
Hi, I thank you, Tay Institute and ITIF to set up this platform to compare national innovation system for 5 countries. This paper investigated on China National Innovation System and co-authored with Dr. Rob Atkinson on China part. I'm Yongjun Kim and the Dean of Graduate Studies of China at SKK University. I'd like to understand and compare China National Innovation System in 3 parts. I basically overview what is characteristic of Chinese and the China National Innovation System, especially following Dr. Atkins' presentation on USA National Innovation System, and Professor Jung's on Korea National Innovation System. So I'd like to compare these 3 systems to come up with understanding of a China National Innovation System. We come up with new analysis and the measure of innovation inputs, outputs, and the outcome. Most of the papers and academic research focus on the innovation inputs and the outputs, but we'd like to extend those innovation output into more of innovation outcome, which we're going to use by Hamilton Index developed by ITIF. Then I will come up with some implication, especially comparing USA and the China National Innovation System. And I'd like to come up with a recent example of how the China come up with a system to catch up with the semiconductor industries. Then I will come up with some perspectives and the conclusion. As you heard from Dr. Atkins on the USA National Innovation System, is more of a market-based, bottom-up, and university and the business come up with the innovation. So it's more of a bottom-up system over the last 20 years. Before, when we have a Cold War period, United States invested heavily on R&D on defense industry. That time, U.S. government played a very strict, controlled R&D investment in the system. But after Cold War, U.S. moved more of a market-based and bottom-up system. And Korea is kind of a combination of top-down and the bottom-up, market-based and the state-controlled system, which you heard from Professor Zhang. China is a very extreme case of a straight controlled top-down system at this moment, especially since 2015, when Chinese government moved into more of an authoritarian system. China come up with a very strict, tight control, top-down system, epoch in Made in China 2025. What are the major players of a state control system in China is MOST, so Ministry of Science and Education, and the Ministry of Industry and Technology. Then Chinese Communist Party come up with a special committee on science and technology and innovation, who is guided by Wang Huning, who are one of the key members of Politburo. So he is a main architecture and of Made in China 2025, and my main architecture of how to catch up of semiconductor industry and the pharmaceutical industry to catch up U.S. technology, science, and innovation. Overall view of Chinese national innovation system in comparison to USA and Korea, we are using GI, Global Innovation Index by WIPO, which is World Intellectual Property Organization. They provide data from 2007 to up to now, and we focus on 2018 to 2023, which is very recent input and output of National Innovation System. Over this period, there are three major events continuing on China National Innovation System. First, Corona, COVID-19. Second is USA-China conflict over in most of the economic and the global marketplace. Third one is Chinese governance system changed from collective system to more of a one-person authoritative system. So over those 5 years, what we observe, what you can see from the graph, red stands for China, black stands for Korea, blue stands for USA. I'd like to focus a little bit on China and Korea following Professor Jung's very detailed arguments on how the Korean National Innovation System developed, evolved, and how it's going to be coming out. As you see in this graph, between 2018 to up to 2023, China, in terms of input, output, national innovation system is getting more effective and efficient. Starting from ranking 17 out of 130 countries up to 12. This phenomena we observed over the last 20 years. China is building up more efficient and effective national innovation system. If you look at Korea has been developed a very effective national innovation system, ranking about 11 to 12, but over the COVID period, 2021, 2022, it goes very high. I have two explanations on this. Korea is a very innovative society, not only in industry and science and technology, but also in nationwide to cope up with COVID-19. Another factor why Korea achieved number 5 and number 4 is other countries who are facing most of the COVID problem was very slow to coping with COVID system. So Korean pali system is working over this period. But as you know, now we got the global observation and the result how each country effectively handle this COVID system in terms of mortality. Korea is not really good. It's below average in terms of the mortality out of total population. So Korea did a lot of innovative action to cope up with, but the final result is not really above the global other countries' indicator. USA still is a very superior national innovation system from 2018 to 2023. We look at it more of innovation inputs by GII index. Inputs are composed of the 5 factors. Institution, more of environment of a government and the government regulation. And second is human capital and the R&D investment. Third one is the infrastructure like ICT and the sustainability of the society. Number 4 is a market sophistication. Number 5 is a business sophistication. How market sophistication more of a financial system of each country. How to invest and credit to the innovative company, how to scale up. Business sophistication is more of societal innovation diffusion to, if it comes up from small company or venture company, how it scale it up. If it comes up from large corporation, how it is diffused to the society up to small, medium company. If you look at this graph of the first one, general environment of institution, Korea is a very stagnant, ranking up to 20th. But if you look at China is at the 2018 ranked about 79. then getting it to 40s. So China changed their government regulation and institutional system more effective input on innovation. Human capital and R&D, as Professor Chung mentioned, Korea used to be number one. I think it's mainly coming from graduate out of high school graduate is 80%. Next is USA, 40%. So Korea come up with a societal national system to produce highly educated people. About 40% of those graduate are engineering and the science background. In contrast, China is very stagnant up to about 20th rank, and they are lacking of university and the college age system. They have about 20 million population graduate from high school, about 12 million getting into college and the educational system. Rest of them are moving out of China to USA, Japan, Korea, Australia, and Canada to get the undergraduate education. But recently, this tight conflict between China and Canada, Australia, and the USA, those numbers of the students coming out of the China to West is decreasing. However, the students who are coming from China to Korea is maintaining, sustaining. In SKKU, we have about 3,500 Chinese students keep coming, even for this COVID period. So China is lacking of human capital and the R&D investment, far behind Korea and the USA. Third factor of input is the infrastructure. Infrastructure refers to telecommunication system, ICT infrastructure, and the general infrastructure of transportation and maintaining and the sustaining of those infrastructure like electricity. China is ranked about 22, 30. It doesn't move a lot, but when they have COVID at the year of 2000s, the infrastructure didn't really work out, especially when they closed down whole societal system. The Chinese infrastructure does not support those who closed the system at the year of 2000s. And in terms of the market sophistication and the business sophistication, the USA is pretty much established a very effective market system. So their financial system, their credit to the companies, their venture capital to the small, medium corporation to come up with the innovation is a very effective system. However, China tried to develop these credit system and the venture capital up to year of 2001, before COVID. As you hear, USA has a San Francisco and China has a Shenzhen. So most of the global investors on the venture capital have office not only in San Francisco, but also in Shenzhen, especially at the year of 2018, 19, 2020, they still invest. But those of global investors after COVID, especially come up with this conflict between US and China, is decreasing. We expect, even though we don't have the statistics of 2024, it's going to come down. It's mainly US global fund already start to exit, and they are very reluctant to come into Shenzhen to invest on Chinese ventures. In terms of the market sophistication, China achieved a very high diffusion of those innovations to the small company and the scaling up. So up to 2022, Chinese government kind of let market, especially small, medium corporation, to come up with innovation, like most of the digital SNS, Alibaba, and Tencent. Those companies are not coming from state-controlled or state-owned enterprise. It's a purely private company to come up with innovation, even though they innovate to imitate American system, like Amazon and like Facebook, YouTube, and Google. However, there have been quite a good innovation in terms of imitative innovation in this digital economy. However, how those innovations diffuse to the society and into small, medium corporation, China kind of maintain those effectiveness of those business sophistication. If you compare to the USA business sophistication, USA is very dominant, leading system of business sophistication, especially during 2020 and 22. I think USA is non-competing in terms of business sophistication. This is a very core competences of USA National Innovation System. If you look at the graph of black collar of Korea, Korea is kind of lagging down, decreasing below China in terms of market sophistication and the business sophistication. Recently, Korea experienced President Yoon government cut down the R&D investment for this year. So people pay attention to those policy. We've been very strong in terms of human capital and the R&D investment. If you government cut down the R&D investment, we're going to be less competitive to Chinese national innovation system. That was most of the mass media and the people understanding. But if you look at this indicator of a market sophistication and the business sophistication, if we lose Korea, losing innovation competitiveness to China, it's not coming from human capital or R&D by the government, but it's going to be market sophistication and the business sophistication. In other words, Korea government have a very heavy regulation on any of the innovation development and the diffuse, especially the financial sector, to provide a credit and to provide venture capital to the innovator has a lot of regulation on it. So Korea is not as efficient or as effective to Chinese market or business sophistication. This has not been noticed and acknowledged in Korean society to achieve the high level of national innovation system. Now let's look at the outputs of innovation over a period of 2018 to 2023. If you look at the red line, China, even though their national innovation system in terms of input is about 20th out of 130 countries, but their output level is number 4, number 6. So their input system is not competitive to Korea or USA, but their output is very efficient. What's the rationale, what's the explanation about this knowledge and the technology output of the China system, which will show in national outcomes by Hamilton Index more extensively and clearly. So if the knowledge and the technology come up from the China over the last 20 years, whether it is state-owned enterprise, whether it is coming from private company, China has the system to capitalize and scaling those innovations into global marketplaces. So they are very good in terms of producing, manufacturing those innovative ideas and products into the market. So they have pretty much a good market system. The companies and the state enterprises pretty much a good system to produce goods and services into the system. One of the good example is Alibaba come up with Alipay. If you go to China now, you cannot take a taxi without Alipay, because most of taxi driver will not take your cash, whether it is US dollar or Chinese RMB. They are not going to take your credit card, whether it's MasterCard or American Express, right? They only take Alipay. So the Alipay system developed, invented by the Alibaba, and it is diffused to the society, even to the taxi driver. If you go to the Beijing and the Shanghai, if you find out the beggar at the street, they are willing to take your cash, but they can take your Alipay money. So they take digital money. Last year in December, I went to Odesan, which is one of the number 4 Chinese mountain. They have a 4 Buddhist temple. Most of those temples, the monk accept digital money. So you can pay Alipay after you bow to the Buddhist monk. So that's how they diffuse those innovations to the society. So knowledge and the technology output is very good in terms of the diffusion and the uses by the customers, Chinese, and they come up with the good products with low price into the marketplace. If you compare the black line of the Korean knowledge and the technology output, is ranked number 10. So, input is number 10, output is number 10, so it is not bad. But if you compare the Chinese system, still Korea is a lack of utilizing and capitalizing knowledge and the technology output into the society and the market. The second is creative outputs of innovation. If you look at the Chinese is very effective. It is increasing in terms of creative output, but it is ranked number 10, 11, and recently is getting down, number 14. And I expect it's going to get down, number 15, 16. The reason I expect Chinese creative output going to decrease, I will explain in conclusion. But if you look at the Korean system one more time, Korea's creative output is surpassing American is getting into number 3 and the number 4. And creative output here is measured by more of creativity in digital product, creativity in films, creativity in intangible asset. So this is a very recent phenomenon. This is what the Korean people and Korean government and innovators would not really recognize. But if you look at a lot of evidence, if you look at the Netflix, the Korean movie and the Korean dramas and the Korean K-pop is getting into number 1, 2, 3 every week. If you look at the Oscar, anime, Korean movie, Korean drama, and Korean directors getting the first prize and the second prize. So this is the phenomena which we really don't capture. I don't really understand why the global consumers, the global markets are so much fascinated about the Korean creativity, which locally, domestically, we don't really define what it is. But this is a phenomenon what happened outside. I don't know whether it's going to be a trend over for the coming 10 years or it's going to be a temporary event. Okay, I and Dr. Atkins, we'd like to share the Hamilton Index of outcomes. Basically, Hamilton Index investigated 10 major industries in global markets to compare the market shares of each country from 1995 to 20. This is China global market share in Hamilton Index industries, and it is pretty much number 1 and dominant in 8 industries out of 10, except IT and the information services and the pharmaceuticals. So China has been pretty good in terms of dominating these manufacturing industries. When we use this Hamilton Index, we have one reservation. What is the causality between innovation input and innovation outcome of this global market share? To determine the global market share, there are a lot of factors besides innovation out of science and technology. Even though we acknowledge those factors, this is a phenomena what China has been dominant in terms of the manufacturing industries. Okay, I'd like to sum him up and to come up with some implication. I compare US and China in terms of these input and the output factors of Global Innovation Index. Still, American system is very good in terms of inputting, in terms of outputting of innovation system. Even though recently Trump and Biden come up with some industrial policy like IRA and the CHIPS Act, we got to see whether those industrial policy going to be effective or not. And we heard that Trump would come in November 11 this year. He's going to stop IRA Act, but we never heard about CHIPS Act. What are we going to do? So we got to see. So I observe USA has been a very bottom-up, market-based national innovation system, recently come up with some industrial policy, but China, over the last 20 years, very state-controlled innovation system. So which is more effective, which is more sustaining, we got to see for the coming 5 years. One of the good examples how China national innovation to catch up with American or USA semiconductor industry is ICRD. This is a nationwide or national organization. I suspect it is initiated by the Chinese Communist Party, stayed on Shanghai, and it is a kind of ecosystem with the University of Fudan and the SMIC, who are the major foundry of Chinese semiconductor industry. ICRD, what is their mission is they basically import most of semiconductor products, semiconductor parts, material, equipment, then research by the major university, then try to disseminate those technology to major semiconductor companies. Especially for the small, medium corporation in China, in semiconductor, even though they have a technology, and to make those products working for Chinese semiconductor industry takes a long time. And there is risk and uncertainty. Chinese government provide about insurance, SMIC and the CMTC, to purchase those local domestic parts and the equipments, to test it. If it is not really good product or effective, efficient product, they provide insurance to the semiconductor company, which I never heard in any of the country, especially when we're comparing USA, Korea, Japan, and Taiwan government to support those small, medium corporations to come up with more of innovative product in semiconductor industry to catch up. Okay, let me conclude on this paper. We just look at the Chinese National Innovation System. It's very state-controlled. It's target-oriented, like a Made in 2025. It has been very effective in terms of their input. The input increased from very low to up to 20th ranked. Their output has been marvelously achieved their target of a Made in 2025. They achieve major global market share in most of the industry except IC, semiconductor industry, and the pharmaceutical. We don't have data on AI and quantum computing and some other new innovative industry like robotics and IC industry. However, China has been pretty good in terms of come up with a national innovation system to come up with imitative innovation. So their system is very effective to catch up with the leading country like USA, Korea, and Japan. And they shows innovation outcomes in global market share. However, this state-controlled China National Innovation System will not be that effective in creative innovation. That's our assertion. Because as you see, previous indicator and analysis of Chinese market and the business sophistication is decreasing due to Xi Jinping's economic policy, would impact negatively on R&D and the venture capital investment from global company. And second, Chinese government's tight control of local domestic Chinese company, whether it's a state-owned or private company, would not come up with the indigenous innovation system, especially for the creative innovation. So recently, China government kind of moving from their tight control to achieve purely indigenous innovation to the China, strategically move more of open innovation with the global companies, especially for investment on Chinese venture capitalists and venture corporation. This is our observation and prediction on it. Has been a lot of learning and understanding of Chinese national innovation system to comparing other 5 countries. I will stop here. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for the Che Institute for the invitation to be here. I'm Stephen Ezel, the Vice President of Global Innovation Policy, the ITIF, and I'm here to talk about the national innovation systems of Japan and Taiwan. So as Peter Hall and David Soskice wrote in their wonderful book, Varieties of Capitalism, Japan can be characterized as a coordinated market economy, which relies on formal institutions such as MITI, the Ministry of Industry, Economics, and Trade, to regulate markets and coordinate firm interactions, especially with integrated industrial conglomerates like the Keiretsu, such as Toshiba, Sony, et cetera. There's very strong top-down control in the economy. But what we see is that Japan reflects a dual economy with highly competitive industrial firms that compete in global markets, but with less competitive domestic serving firms. Ultimately, Japan's innovation model since World War II has proven successful in helping the country catch up to the global production frontier in many industrial sectors. However, it's proven less effective in enabling Japanese companies to compete in new industries like biotechnology or ICT services. And ultimately, weak entrepreneurship rates, weak industry-university linkages, and low productivity in non-traded sectors really have stymied Japan's innovation economy. So after World War II, MITI-led industrial policy targeted key industries like automobiles, electronics, pharmaceuticals, and shipbuilding, with policies like controls on technology and foreign direct investment. This really shielded Japanese domestic firms from global competition and protected markets, enabling them to grow. Another key attribute of MITI's policy was that it supported the acquisition of foreign technologies, especially U.S. technologies. U.S. antitrust policy led to the U.S. actually giving away many advanced technologies, such as integrated circuits from Bell Labs or RCA or Zenith technology and television. So this is a very well-crafted industrial policy to help Japanese companies grow in these industries. The policies were so successful that they contributed to the so-called Japanese economic miracle, as Japanese economic growth from 1955 to 1990 averaged nearly 7% a year, and its GDP multiplied 8-fold over that period. This actually prompted Ezra Vogel, a Harvard Business School professor, to say in 1979 that, quote, Japan will surpass the United States as the world's leading economy. But actually what happened next was the bursting of the Japanese economic bubble that would give rise to several lost decades of economic stagnation. Much of this was driven by the 1985 Plaza Accords. The U.S., suffering significant trade imbalances with Japan, prevailed upon Japan and Germany to appreciate their currencies. Over the following 2 years, the Japanese yen appreciated by 28% against the U.S. dollar. So as Japanese exporters were weakened in global competition, the response of the Japanese government was to lower interest rates to try to stimulate a kind of domestic economic growth. What this actually led to, though, was an asset bubble, investment in property, et cetera. And the lost decades ultimately resulted in Japan's share of global GDP falling by nearly half, from 10% in 1990 to just 5% by 2022. And we really see this when we look at Japan's faltering share of global advanced industry output as reflected in the Hamilton Index. In fact, if you can see the gray line here, this represents Japan. Japan's share of markets in these 11 industries decreased from 23% in 1995 to just 7% by 2020. Conversely, China's share, reflected in the blue line, increased from 4% to 25% over this time. And Japan's fall in competitiveness in market share was particularly pronounced in some of the most important industries. So from 1995 to 2020, Japan's global market share in pharmaceuticals fell by 71%. It fell by 71% as well in electrical equipment and 80% in computers and electronics. So this is very substantial industrial decline. We have, of course, been talking about location quotients this afternoon. These represent an industry's share of a country's economy relative to their share of the global economy. And what this chart shows you with the histogram is the declining market share for Japan in each one of these industries, but it also shows you the declining location quotients, so the decreasing relative advantage. In fact, from 1995 to 2020, there were only 2 industries, machinery and equipment and motor vehicles, where Japan's location quotient actually increased. So this is pretty significant signs of industrial decline. So in response, the Japanese government has tried to promulgate a number of national innovation strategies to arrest this decline. Whereas Korea was perhaps on 5-year plans, Japan's been more on 10-year plans. So in 1995, we saw the Science and Technology Basic Law. By 2006, under President Abe, with the 3 Arrows policy, we had the Innovation 25 initiative. And then in 2016, we saw Japan introduce the Society 5.0 strategy. This sought to, quote, establish a better, super smart, and more prosperous human-centered society through the support of technological innovations. Essentially, Japan's Society 5.0 was akin to Germany's Industry 4.0, really talking about the integration of cyber and physical spaces, digitalize the economy. While the Society 5.0 strategy was heavily trumpeted, however, the reality is that when you looked at Japan's rank on the Bloomberg Innovation Index from 2015 to 2021, you saw it only continue to decrease. So from 2nd place in 2015 to 12th by 2021. So it thus became apparent to Japanese policymakers that the Society 5.0 innovation strategy wasn't really working. So in 2023, the Japanese government came out with a whole new strategy called the Integrated Innovation Strategy of 2023. This had 3 key focus areas. First, to foster development of the technologies that support the future of the country and guide their application in society. Essentially, this just meant promoting R&D for sustainable technologies. Second, advance international brain circulation to create a source of science, technology, innovation, and value creation. This, of course, targeted to address the long-standing challenge that internationalization has really been a challenge for Japan. And third, support the startup ecosystem by expanding SBIR, or in the US, Small Business Innovation Research-like programs, and their subsequent societal diffusion of advanced technologies by startups. And this was to be enabled by the $88 billion university fund, seeking explicitly to enhance R&D and incentivize technology transfer to the commercial sector. And one reason why that challenge matters so much for Japan, because overall, just 4% of new university technologies get licensed to startups in Japan, whereas the comparative rate in the United States is 17%. Japan's Integrated Innovation Strategy is the product of MITI, MITI being Japan's principal agenda-setting institution for innovation. While MITI sets the agenda, much of the investment institutionally actually occurs through NATO, the New Energy and Industrial Technology Development Organization in Japan. So this is the national R&D agency promoting tech development. However, Another key and often overlooked institution within Japan's national innovation system are these public industrial technology research institutes, the Kosusutsu centers. These essentially are innovation intermediaries that are focused on diffusing technological know-how to SMEs and helping them develop innovative networks to connect to external sources of knowledge. One reason the Kosusutsu centers are so important is to support the Chukin Kigyo. Just like Germany has the Mittelstand of very competitive mid-sized industrial firms, so Japan's Chukin Kigyo are mid-sized industrial firms dominating their markets. These are Japanese companies that serve more than 70% of the worldwide demand in over 30 industrial sectors with over $1 billion each. When we look at the key innovation inputs going into Japan's national innovation system, we see that while they are very strong, they've actually decreased relative to their peers in recent years. So while Japan's national R&D intensity did rise from 2% in 1981 to 3.3% today, it's actually been surpassed by Japan in national R&D intensity and China in absolute R&D dollars. The government accounts for 53% of R&D investment in Japan, universities 40%, but industry only 7%. And that's very concerning because the corporate share of R&D investment in Japan is actually half the US level and only 1/3 of the Korean level. Japan has 55 researchers per 10,000 citizens, and that's strong globally, although it has fallen behind leaders such as Korea. Tax credits are an important part of innovation policy in Japan. However, today they only rank 18th in the OECD in R&D tax credit generosity, although that does exceed US, Australian, and Korean levels. But I think two of the biggest challenges in Japan's national innovation systems really revolve around, one, these very weak industry-academia linkages, and then their low productivity rates. So we heard earlier Dr. Jiang say that in Korea, the government funds 82% of university R&D. And while that is true, when we look at average industry funding per academic researcher, we see that that level of investment is still 6 times higher in Germany or Korea as opposed to Japan. So Japan invests 1/6 the level Germany or Korea does in industry funding academic researchers. Another data point is, of course, university R&D funded by business enterprises as a share of total university R&D funding. And here again, we see that Korea invests 3 times the rate Japan does in university R&D funded by business enterprises. So this really reflects the university as the ivory tower challenge in Japan's economy. Languishing productivity remains a serious challenge as well for Japan's economy. This chart looks at per hour labor productivity among OECD nations in 2022. It finds that Japan's per hour labor productivity is just 64% that of the United States. And in fact, if we roll the tape back to the year 1970, we see that among the G7 nations, Japan has had the lowest productivity level every year since 1970 among G7 countries. And it's actually not getting any better. In 2020, Japan ranked 23rd for labor productivity among OECD nations, which was its lowest ranking since 1970. Not only does Japan rank lowest among OECD leaders in productivity, Japan actually ranks last among OECD nations in the average annual entry rate of new enterprises, with a level less than 1/3 of the United States. As a report from the National Bureau of Asian Research wrote recently, quote, "Japan is largely perceived as a challenging place for entrepreneurs to launch successful businesses. The organization man culture stunts entrepreneurship and new firm creation." One of the challenges in Japan does relate to culture. 55% of potential Japanese entrepreneurs admit, quote, that they are afraid of failure, which is the second highest rate in the entire world. They're actually not helped by substantial access to venture capital. Now, while the numbers did increase a bit in 2023, as Rob's chart showed earlier, looking at 2022 data, there was only $6.7 billion of investment in startups going into Japan. That was compared to Korea's $5 billion, despite the fact that Korea's economy is 40% the size of Japan's. China recorded $70 billion of investment in startups that year, and the US $238 billion. So this lack of risk capital in Japan is very concerning. Another challenge is limited legal liability and outdated bankruptcy laws. So in Japan, if you're an entrepreneur whose business fails and you've incurred debt to start that business, the debt can actually, you die, that debt can actually follow on to your heirs. It's not forgiven, it goes with the family. So this is one more factor that militates against entrepreneurship in Japan. And that's really concerning because this lack of entrepreneurial dynamism really forestalls, the dynamic of creative destruction. It forestalls dynamism in the economy. And that's concerning because Japanese companies founded after 1996 have actually contributed 1.2 million new jobs to Japan's economy, whereas older firms, those founded before 1996, have actually shed 3.1 million jobs since 1996. So this is a real concern for Japan's ability, as reflected earlier, to enter into entirely new industries. This is one reason why Japan has been so weak in competing in sectors like biotechnology, information technology, the digital economy, platforms, because they lack this creative dynamism. So to conclude, overall, Japan's national innovation system has been marked by significant government guidance and close connections with industrial leaders. That approach once worked well, but today, Japan's industrial competitiveness is sliding, productivity is languishing, and entrepreneurship is lagging. So though Japan has many strengths, it really needs to reimagine its innovation strategies if it's going to compete successfully in the 21st century digital economy. So much like Japan, Taiwan can be characterized as a coordinated market economy. Its national innovation system is grounded in a whole-of-government approach. But different to Japan, it does incorporate more top-down and bottom-up elements. Taiwan's NIST is more corporatist than America's, featuring more formal cooperation, learning, and consensus building between industry and government. When we did research for this report, it was pointed out that industrial or trade associations, like the Taiwan Electrical and Electronics Manufacturing Association, met regularly with governments to develop strategies and plans to identify challenges to the industry and kind of come up with strategies in collaboration with the government. That type of very close coordination between an industry association and a government agency would be less common in the United States, for instance. Just like in Japan with MITI, very powerful agencies, in this case, the Industrial Technology Research Institute, ITRI, have played catalytic roles in Taiwan's economic development. Since World War II, you could say that Taiwan's strategy has evolved from an initial focus on import substitution industrialization and kind of factor-driven growth to first efficiency-driven and then technology and innovation-driven growth. So it's been explained to me, in the 1950s and 60s, Taiwan really focused on these factor cost, labor cost-driven sectors, being competitive in things like textiles and toys. As their economy evolved into the 60s and 70s, it moved into efficiency-driven sectors like bicycle, auto parts, industrial components. And then as Taiwan further built out its competitiveness in its technology ecosystem, it then moved into innovation-driven industries like semiconductors, increasing levels of domestic value added, and developing exports for high-tech industries. Institutionally, the leading institutions in Taiwan's national innovation system are three. It's Taiwan's National Science and Technology Council, the NSTC, which has overall responsibility for the articulation and organization of Taiwan's NIST strategy and policy. However, the NSTC delegates to the MOEA, Taiwan's Ministry of Economic Affairs, which is responsible for the implementation of the relevant industrial, trade, foreign direct investment, IP, et cetera, policies to actually execute that national innovation system. Then within MOEA, there is the critical Department of Industrial Technology, DOIT, which implements three key technology development partnership programs to enhance industrial technology and accelerate the upgrading of industry. DOIT has TDPs with industry, academia, and nonprofit organizations. But of these three, the key is the DOIT flagship institute, which is ITRI. It is a nonprofit R&D institute conducting R&D into applied technologies. We should note that ITRI was actually set up in 1973, in part through the impetus of the US government. And the US has a long history of helping countries like Germany launch their Fraunhofer system, Taiwan with ITRI, but we often don't take our own advice. But ITRI's mission is to help Taiwan establish innovative science and technology industries. Its role is to facilitate technology adoption and upgrading. ITRI follows a DARPA-like model characterized by short-term, nimble projects whose specific goal is to seek to advance technology projects from a TRL, or technology readiness level, of 4 or 5, which is really about initial technology feasibility and evaluation in a lab, to TRL 8 or 9, which is operational deployment of a new technology in the field. So ITRI is actually out there helping develop new technologies and push them to the market. ITRI has 6,000 employees and has produced more than 15,000 patents since it started. Today, ITRI staffers produce an average of 5 patents each and every day. And as you know, many of Taiwan's most successful and important companies, including TSMC and UMC, are ITRI graduates. Taking the conversation back to our Hamilton Index and looking at these 11 key industries, we see that Taiwan has a really impressive share. These industries, whereas the global average is that they contribute about 12% to countries' economies, they contribute more than twice that, 24.9% to Taiwan's economy. And it will not surprise you that when we look at these 11 industries, we see that from the location quotient perspective, it's really computers and electronics, semiconductors. Taiwan has a location quotient of 9 in this sector. So the concentration or specialization of computers and electronics in Taiwan's economy is kind of 9 times higher than the global average. Relatively, they also do well in other industries, including chemicals, metals, and transportation. Taiwan's weakest industries comparatively are motor vehicles, IT and information services, and pharmaceuticals. And in fact, when you review the innovation literature about Taiwan, you see that there's a real frustration that they have not been able to replicate the success in the biotechnology industry that they have been able to achieve in the ICT industry. It's also worth noting that even since 1995, Taiwan's competitiveness in computers and electronics has only continued to increase over this time. Like the countries we have studied in this cohort, Taiwan evinces some of the strongest innovation inputs in the entire world. Taiwan's national R&D intensity has been increasing virtually every year since 2010, and today Taiwan is the world's 3rd most R&D intensive nation, behind only Israel and Korea. However, a concern for Taiwan is that the share of government R&D expenditures in total R&D expenditures has actually decreased by 2/3 from 1991 to 2018. So in a way that's good. You could argue that Taiwanese companies have been successful enough that they can make up for this lack of this shortfall of government investment. That's a fair point to make. Others might make the point that, well, this is largely driven by a couple of very important semiconductor companies, and if they were for some reason to lose competitiveness, that this lack of government investment could become problematic for Taiwanese economy. In terms of the science and technology workforce, Taiwan has one of the highest higher education densities in the world. In fact, Taiwan has 152 universities, colleges, or junior colleges for a population of only 23 million citizens. An incredibly high education density. This chart looks at the share of first degrees awarded in science and engineering fields. Taiwan does very strong here. However, when you talk to stakeholders, they say a concern is that the share of first degree awards in S&E fields has declined from 42% in 2010 to 37% in 2018, and they're actually graduating 10,000 fewer S&E graduates per year. So strength, but concern with regard to the depth of the highly skilled workforce in Taiwan. So the paper will go in and look at the history of the promulgation of Taiwan's innovation strategies. And if you trace it back to 1960, just like Korea, there were innovation strategies released every 5 years for pretty much the past 60 years. I won't go into detail in those. I'll just bring you up to the present and say that Taiwan's national innovation strategy today is what's called the 5+2+2 strategy. Essentially, Taiwan has identified 6 core strategic industries. Those are information and digital, cybersecurity, national defense, strategic stockpiles, precision health, and green and renewable energy. And then these 6 core industries are to be supported by 5 horizontal technologies or platforms: smart machinery, green energy, biotech and pharmaceutical. And then underpinning them are these kind of enablers, technology enablers, AI, 5G, kind of circular economy. I would not have designed this strategy myself. It does seem somewhat confusing, but when you talk to Taiwanese stakeholders and say, what does this really mean? They'll tell you, well, this is really about 2 things. One, it's really about digitalization of the Taiwanese economy and the internet enablement of it. And it's also designed to be responsive to what in Taiwan is referred to as the 5 shortages. That is the lack of sufficient land, water, power, manpower, and talent. So overcoming the 5 shortages is the key impetus of Taiwan's national innovation strategy today. I'll also add that more recently, Taiwan has announced a new, quote, AI on a chip strategy, and this seeks to advance pervasive AI across Taiwan's smart manufacturing, semiconductor, robotics, and autonomous driving systems. It's important to realize that amongst the countries we've looked at today, Taiwan's economy is the most dependent on exports and participation in global value chains. So today, exports account for 70% of GDP, manufacturing for 26% of its GDP. And when you look at Taiwan's global value chain participation rate as a share of total exports, Taiwan's actually the 7th most GVC-dependent country in the entire world. So what does this mean? Well, Taiwan needs assuredness of its access to global markets, both for the inputs to its critical semiconductor sector, but also to sell exports on a competitive basis. So this really, of course, puts the geopolitical situation Taiwan finds itself in today in stark relief. Lastly, I'll just provide some comments on Taiwan's entrepreneurial ecosystem. When we look at what's called TIA, or total early stage entrepreneurial activity, Taiwan's actually higher than many other industrial economies. 15.5% of 18 to 64-year-olds say they intend to start a business in Taiwan in the next 3 years. It's actually more than in the United States and substantially more than in Japan. So that does kind of evince strong desires for entrepreneurship in Taiwan. However, a concern is that today, only 1/3 of entrepreneurs in Taiwan have STEM backgrounds. And when we did our background research for this project, one observer noted that, quote, Taiwanese entrepreneurs today are more likely to want to open a coffee shop than a tech company. So there's some concern about the level of ambition of budding Taiwanese entrepreneurs today. So I'll wrap it up with some conclusions on Taiwan's national innovation system. Ultimately, its challenge today is to prove that it can move from fast follower to global leader beyond industries that aren't only semiconductors or ICTs. In doing research for this report, there was a sense among stakeholders that Taiwan has moved from at least the younger generation in Taiwan, perhaps has moved from being hungry, addressing this existential threat that Rob talked about earlier, and this desire to develop and catch up with today's success, potentially breeding complacency and risk aversion. It's really important that Taiwan, going forward, complement its strengths in ICT hardware with ICT software. As we saw in the Hamilton Index data, very strong on the computers and electronics side of the equation, but not nearly as strong in kind of the digital economy, especially with new technologies like artificial intelligence. That's why they have the whole AI and the chip strategy now. Taiwan does need to amplify its risk capital availability. Numbers are more scarce on VC in Taiwan, as we saw, but it's still a fraction of peers we're looking at. And the US and its allies really should work with Taiwan to help them deepen their innovation linkages and also help them facilitate their engagement in international organizations. We should work, for instance, to make Taiwan not just an observer, but actual member of the OECD going forward. Other organizations like the World Health Organization, International Civil Aviation Organization, Interpol, that Taiwan aren't a part of. So there's much allies can do to help Taiwan advance its innovation system going forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Today I learned a lot about yesterday and today of national innovation systems in these 5 economies. But I want to learn more, especially learn more about the future challenges and future opportunities. And I'd like to go, I'm a little bit ambitious. We want to go beyond the national innovation systems. So my common questions, all the 4 speakers, is that what do you see about the future of national innovation systems in East Asia and America? So competition and cooperation among those national innovation systems. Or to be more ambitious, what would transnational innovation systems in East Asia and America would look like? So, but I will take the reverse order. We have about 24 minutes left. So each speakers will address my questions, or feel free to make your own concluding remarks. Each one can use about 4 minutes of, 5 minutes or so. So let's take the reverse order. We will start from Stefan.
I mean, Rob pointed out at the beginning that there's no one single country or region of the world that gets innovation policy maximally, that some countries are better at certain aspects than others. So I think it's what's really been shown by the comments today is that the US has a really unique set of strengths, especially around entrepreneurship and creative destruction and dynamism. And that's a dynamic that seems to be lacking in several of the Asian countries we've looked at. So conversely, the US is to some degree weaker in kind of the engineering side of the equation, right? You look at, science and engineering, and America does great at investing in basic science, but that creates knowledge that is freely appropriable to any country in the world. It's the ability to engineer that enables a country to capture a share of that scientific knowledge they're creating and actually create value in the United States. So then it's the obverse, right? Can the Asian countries learn from the United States on the entrepreneurship side of the equation? Can the United States learn from the Asian counterparts and kind of this ability to turn science into engineering-based innovation that's appropriate for growth at home? That'd be one observation I'd make. Another would be, the reality is that all these countries are chasing the same advanced technology industries today, right? So every country we've looked at has a strategy for semiconductors, a strategy for pharmaceuticals, for clean energy technologies. And what's really changed is that it's not only China, but it's now also all of our countries that are plunking billions of dollars into the competition for these sectors. In the US, $267 billion for clean energy. In the IRA, we have the CHIPS and Science Act for $52 billion. So can we, at least among the allied nations, come to some degree of coordination about how we're trying to compete on productive, positive sum, market-based terms in these industries, I think becomes critically important. So the effects are not zero-sum, but they're positively additive. One way we can do that in semiconductors is that the reality is there's a global shortage of semiconductor talent. We're going to trade 1 million more individuals in semiconductors alone by 2030 to address the fact that the industry's growth is expected to increase from $600 billion to $1 trillion by the end of this decade. So that would be a great example where like-minded countries, the US and Korea, can collaborate on education with your K-ball strategy, with our CHIPS and Science strategy. So ensuring we don't have overcapacity or a glut in these advanced tech industries, I think, becomes very important. I guess one other point I'd add is, are there ways we can formalize some of these types of linkages? This is a wonderful study that the Chi Institute puts forward. But Rob Atkinson served on kind of an innovation experts working group that existed under the Obama administration between China and the United States. We need to have an innovation experts working group among the, at least the countries we've studied here to allow for kind of the harvesting and dissemination of best practices and lessons learned from this type of research. So studies are great, but formalized mechanisms to learn from one another, I think, will be very important as well going forward.
Thank you very much. Several years ago, I had a chance to organize OECD KDI workshop on innovation diffusion across regions and firms. And I was very glad to hear that you mentioned that we might have room for positive sum game. And actually, it was what was happening in East Asia for many decades. But new challenges coming from this new landscape of competition, especially between G2 countries, US and China. So I'm curious what we can learn from Yongjun for future challenges and opportunities in this region.
Okay, thank you very much. What is a future challenge of China National Innovation System? What are the opportunities? When we talk about this innovation in terms of time horizon of the future, I'm limited to the coming 10 years, right? So what are the products and what are the innovation of global innovators pursuing? First one is AI. In 2024, in CES of exhibition, AI was pretty much popularized by robotics, not the language or vision of AI initiated by OpenAI and Google Gemini. So if that is the case, China certainly have a competitive advantage of robotics. They have technology and they have innovation. It's coming from imitative innovation. Basically, they just copy it instead of purchasing American innovative robotics company. As Dr. Atkins mentions, out of 60, 70 new air robotics company, about 40 companies coming from United States. But it seems like it can be easily manufactured by imitation or imitative innovation. In China, they have indigenous innovators and venture company. At the same time, China government set it up two cluster in terms of robotics ecosystem. One is in Shenzhen. It's actually between Hangzhou and the Shenzhen area. The other one is Beijing. Beijing is more of a software center. So China government kind of let private company come up with the innovation, then try to set it up the infrastructure or ecosystem to export those product into the global market, which has been pretty competitive and the competing edge over the U.S. system. I never heard U.S. government to set up ecosystem for robotics or ecosystem or eco world or cluster development for specific future innovation. Second example is the electrical vehicle. Autonomous electrical vehicle has been developed, invented by the U.S. American system, American company, but has been extensively used in Shenzhen area. If you go to the Shenzhen, about 50% of the taxi is autonomous EV. Right? So people are start to build a confidence, even though we don't have any report what are the accidents coming out of automatic EV at the Shenzhen area, which we heard a lot of things in the United States coming from Google and Tesla, but not from the China system. However, they implemented it, they executed, they learning from those experimentation at the Shenzhen. So there's a possibility automotive EV, not only from battery system or the EV system, the operating system of automatic EV in specific city or region could be a hot topic for the coming years. And third one, in terms of the future innovation, gonna be a space industry. Okay, recently American private company set it up second trial on the moon landing, and China has set it up the outspace station for, I think, USA and the Soviet Union, other country trying to share those stations. So China is government and the state-owned enterprise and the companies are pursuing some leading edge on the space industry too. So those are the challenges I see for the coming 10 years of the future of innovation in terms of the products and the services. However, I need to make the comments on the challenge of Chinese national innovation system for the future innovation. If the state control tightly from the planning to planning of input, output, and the outcomes to the global market, the people who are working under those systems, unless they are incentivized properly, they have no incentive to come up or produce or share their own indigenous invention idea or innovative idea to the company or society. I think that's the very human being, natural, egocentric motivation. So I'm not quite sure China can develop any of the government or company to come up with those motivation incentive system compatible to induce or share with the company or society, as long as market and the business sophistication allows, which they have been enjoyed over the 1990s and the 2000s. Alibaba, Jingdong, Tencent, they have a market system. They are allowed to use American capital market system to incentivize the inventor and workers inside of the company. At this time, we don't have that kind of a system under Chinese innovation system. So that's the question and the challenge which China government got to face.
Thank you very much. We are slightly behind schedule, but I'd like to ask Hyuk, because we learned about this 6% growth, annual growth for 6 decades, quite unique and remarkable for Korea. But I want to hear from you what you think about the future prospect of Korean economic development and the development in East Asia, especially with a focus on technology and innovation.
Okay, I guess given the time limit, I'll make it quick. The main first observation is that Korea is at the slippery slope. It can actually fall to really even zero growth, or it can maintain like US growth, where the 2% of growth has been maintained for more than 200 years. So innovation would play the key role to avoid the bad equilibrium. And to do that, I think two things we should remember. One is from the Korean side, the internal reforms are really needed in two ways. One is ideas should be actually protected first. Otherwise, innovating ideas would not flourish. So that's one thing. And the second thing is the actors of the national innovation system are firms, we say government, university, but in the current STI governance, not all these stakeholders are participating in designing science and technology innovation policy. So that platform needs to be changed. And from the second aspect, I think that's not only for Korea, but also for other countries. Thinking about global partnership would be important, because not just Korea, but the entire globe is facing the low growth, and considering this declining population future, and reviving the innovation as the engine of regaining growth is important. So the global idea sharing is important. However, again, which is possible under the premise of the very precise idea protection. So given that, perhaps we can share idea more actively in terms of strategic way. One idea about the strategic partnership would be we can better match the technological comparative advantage with economic comparative advantage. And that'll benefit not a single country, but the entire set of countries. That framework is really what we need to mobilize and promote the global partnership of idea sharing.
Thank you very much. The term you raised, strategic partnership, sounds quite important to me. And final discussant is Rob. And I would like to hear more about your views on the room for strategic partnership between Korea and U.S., or if we go a little bit beyond this two-country alliance, room for strategic partnership in East Asia and the Pacific under the continuing leadership of the U.S. So feel free to teach us.
Sure. You know, I think one of the things that's interesting to me about this whole question now, there's a famous line by Schumpeter that said that innovation is like an uncharted sea. And it really is. You know, if there was no innovation, I could tell my two kids, hey, when you get to be my age, the world's going to be exactly the same. It's very secure to know that I have to deal with change. But obviously it's not. And I think what's different today to me is for so many centuries and decades, we've all been wanting to get to this point. And a lot of us are now at that point. We live a pretty good life in Korea, pretty good life in the US. The question is, where do we go next? And I think there's less consensus around where to go. With regard to the question about China, about partnership, I think we're going to now live in in the Soviet era, we had three blocks, if you had. We had the First World, we had the Second World, which was the communist countries, Eastern Europe, China, and the Soviet Union, and then we had the so-called Third World. I think we're going to move into a world that's very similar. Again, there'll be three spheres. There'll be the US-centric sphere, there'll be the China-centric sphere, and then there'll be the unaligned sphere. I would put India was unaligned in the last Cold War, they'll be unaligned in this Cold War. But I think ultimately countries are going to have to choose. And the reason I say that is I think we're particularly in the next administration, no matter who's in power, the pressure to really pull out from China, to decouple, to not invest there, to keep their investments from coming into our countries is going to grow and it's going to continue, particularly as China can get into EVs. Now think about the threat to the Korean auto market, which you never had a threat from China before. Think about the threat to the Korean semiconductor market, which you never had a threat before, and then obviously does. So I think what we're going to hopefully end up with is a much more tightly integrated allied innovation system. And I think if we do that right, that's going to include things like shared commercial intelligence, sharing about what we're all doing. It'll be sharing our best practices. It'll be setting up state S&T programs that build in partnerships from the beginning. Right now, we tack partnerships on here and there. We need to design systems with those built in from the beginning. The last thing I'll say on this, which I say it as a friend, I say it in all sensitivity, particularly if Trump wins, one of the things that I believe President Trump will say before he wants to decide whether somebody is a partner or not is, are your policies discriminatory against American companies? And I think in the case of Korea, some policies are. I couldn't use my Google Maps here. Trying to figure that one out. Why couldn't I use my Google Maps here? I've been reading about potential cloud computing restrictions. And again, I say that as a friend because I do think the next administration, if it's a Trump administration, is going to look at those things and say, we're going to partner with Taiwan because they're not doing that. Or we're going to partner with the Brits because they're not doing that. So I do think it's important. Now, you could say you don't want to partner with us. That's fine. That's, you know, nobody has to partner with anybody. But I do think, and I say that in other ways, I think we're going to have to build our policies that are supportive of each other, as opposed to the last model that we've all been in, which is we're going to build our policies to support each of ourselves alone. I mean, that's what the U.S. innovation system largely was. That's what yours was. That's what the Japanese was. So I think in terms of both the positive parts of having partnerships built in, but also making sure that we don't have policies, even if they're inadvertent, that might discriminate against our allies and friends. I think that's going to be a key part of going forward.
Thank you very much. I was surprised to hear that still you cannot use Google Map here, because in my case, I can use both Korean maps and Google Maps. I don't know. Probably the map you can see.
I can see the map,
But
I can't get directions.
but recently, I heard some concerns from foreign tourists that they have difficulties in using Korean sites because some are not friendly enough. So I think huge room for improvement there.
I just show you one other example. I had a piece in the Korean Times recently, and it was talking about the proposed platform law in Korea. And I don't know, I look at that as a proposed law focused on American companies. And, you know, we can have a discussion about whether that's true or not. I'm not saying, you know, but my point is the Trump administration will look at that and go, yeah. So.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Just had one more thought on what we can do collaboratively. You know, the number of Taiwanese students studying in the United States has declined by 40% since the year 2000. And I know there have been similar declines from some of the other countries. So we should really kind of invest more in the, you know, brain circulation and knowledge circulation among our countries, you know, as a way to diffuse best practices on, you know, innovation and technology.
Thinking about that global partnership and strategies, I intentionally use the term global because that partnership may not be limited within East Asia or just between U.S., Korea, like a U.S., China, or U.S., Japan. So that combination can emerge endogenously, but just ex ante limitation of the partnership may limit the global sharing of ideas. So that's the one caveat that I want to emphasize ex post.
Look, if we were living in an ideal world where everybody's playing by the rules and nobody ever steals any intellectual property, I'm not going to say who it is, but it's one of those 5 countries. If we were living in that world, I would agree with you. I think information sharing and knowledge sharing and circulation with China is detrimental to global innovation. And the reason I say that, let me give you, Stephen and I led a study on that where we looked at the effect on global innovation of Chinese policies. The year that patenting peaked in the solar panel industry, the PV industry, the year that global patenting peaked was 2010. That was the year when Chinese solar panels took off. It was the year when German companies went bankrupt, when Japanese companies went bankrupt, U.S. companies went bankrupt. I'd be perfectly fine to have sort of this global innovation network if the Chinese government was not doing what it's doing. But you know, we're gonna see a DRAM glut. If we're not already seeing it, we're going to see a DRAM glut pretty soon. Not because that some Chinese market-based company decided it wanted to build more DRAMs, but because the Chinese government said, we're going to build more DRAMs, we're going to intentionally flood the market, we're going to destroy one DRAM company, or at least take their market share away. That's what I worry about with the future of innovation, because you can't innovate unless you can make money. And if the bottom of your innovation keeps falling off because the Chinese are stealing it or taking it, you stop innovating.
My father-in-law, he was doing business in footwear industry. But in the 1990s, textile industry and footwear industry, which used to be exporters for Korea as top, they belong to top 5 export items in Korea for several decades. In the 1990s, they disappeared. So Korean textile industry and footwear industry were just wiped out because of China. So I really hear you, and I share your concerns. During your presentations, I thought that the time, 20 minutes for each speaker, too short. And now I'm realizing that the time for discussion is too short, but we have to stop here, but we will continue our discussion in the future. And, you know, I hope that the issue of technology and innovation, I think it should remain high on priorities for the Che Institute, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about the future projects. And I really thank for speakers and discussants. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure all of us are looking forward to learning more from all of you. Thank you very much.